Hello and welcome to my channel. This time I am going to talk about the history and the future of religion in Finland. The historical period begins in the area now known as Finland as late as 1100 to 1200 Common Era, because there are practically no literary sources from the time before that. The Iron Age was directly followed by the Middle Ages, which is a little odd, but these are what we are used to calling these periods in Finland. From the 12th or 13th century onward, Catholic Christianity and Swedish rule took hold of much of the area. Written sources survive from that time onwards, meaning this is when prehistory ends and history begins in Finland. Christianity had been influencing Finland a little before this, but only now became the ruling religion. The Vikings had been trading in the area without leaving much of a lasting mark on culture, as far as I know. The ancient religion of the Finnish peoples, of which there were several, a form of pagan religion distinct from Scandinavian mythology and religion, still existed, at least in some forms, long afterwards, despite Christianity taking hold at the same time. The ruling class was mostly made of Swedish-speaking Christians, while the lower class, who spoke various forms of Finnish, combined Christianity with their pagan beliefs. With time, pagan beliefs died out, but there were still traces of that in the 19th century in folklore and traditional poetry, as well as magic practices. At the end of the 16th century, Lutheran Reformation in the Kingdom of Sweden also applied to Finland, as it was the eastern part of the kingdom. There was a century of Lutheran orthodoxy, during which time Lutheranism was being purified by removing features of Catholicism from it. There was much less interest in or attention toward ancient pagan traditions or superstitions, and such things were generally tolerated. Theologians did bring the so-called theory of the witches' Sabbath to Finland, and some witchcraft trials resulted from that in the 1660s. Few were actually killed, as even those at first sentenced to death in lower courts typically had the sentence commuted in the higher court, where those cases were always retried. In Finland, the majority of those accused of witchcraft were men, so it is not true that the witch hunts were only or even mainly about misogyny. The state and the church had already been strongly connected to each other, but during the first centuries of Lutheranism, the church and state were even more intertwined, as the clergy formed a significant part of the state's officials and clerks. The etymology of the word clerk is especially revealing. Pietism spread to Finland toward the end of the 17th century, criticizing the connection between the church and the state. From 1726 to 1870, a law was used in an attempt to subdue Pietism by outlawing religious gatherings without the priest of the congregation present. The priests were to be always participating in such gatherings in order to guide their flock and keep them from falling into heresy. Regardless of such attempts, various forms of religious revivalism popped up during the 19th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, new forms of Protestantism spread from the USA to Finland. Because they wanted to remain separate from the state, they had been called Vapaat Suunnat, free factions or something. These are forms of pietism, including a variety of somewhat different views. They include the Free Church, Baptism, Methodism, Adventism, and the Salvation Army, and others. The Eastern Orthodox Church influenced the eastern parts of Finland, or the area now known as Finland, during the Middle Ages already, but more significantly after 1809, when Finland was annexed by the Russian Empire and became a Grand Duchy under the Tsar. Eastern Orthodoxy never became a major form of religion in Finland. The vast majority of Finnish people remained Lutheran, and the number of Orthodox people who immigrated was not numerically great. That is why, when speaking of the Church, I am referring to the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland. The Orthodox Church of Finland does still have some special privileges, but it is not as significant as the other. During the Middle Ages and beyond, everyone was simply assumed to be members of the church through their local congregation. After the Reformation, each ruler chose the religion of their subjects, with only some possible exceptions. Sweden did not allow any non-Lutherans in the kingdom. Jews were finally, in 1782, allowed to live in certain restricted areas, none of which were in Finland. There were almost no non-Christians in Finland until the 19th century, during which some Jews and some Tatars immigrated. They were allowed to practice their religions, Judaism and Islam, respectively. Local, I guess the term here is municipal, governments of villages and towns were divided in 1859 into two separate organizations with their own spheres of interest. The local church meetings, for lack of a better term, was to take care of religious matters, while the municipal meeting, again for lack of better translation, took care of all secular matters. In 1866, the new decree about elementary schools made elementary schools municipal, removing them from the purview of the congregations. Until then, it had been the task of the church to take care of all education. Grammar schools, which required 4 years of elementary school to enter, were still run by the church until 1870, when a new law about the church increased the independence of the church from the state. All education was turned over to secular authorities with the same law. From then on, the church has written all the laws concerning itself. They still have to pass legislation as any law. It was possible toward the end of the century to change one's religious affiliation by joining either the Orthodox or the Lutheran Church, but those were the only options. This was probably mostly for the technical reason that the religious organizations kept the only records of people. This continued even after the law of 1870, in part all the way to 1999, when finally record keeping was completely turned over to secular authorities. Finland became an independent country in 1917. There was a civil war in the following year. From 1917 on, there had been a registry for people who were not members of any religious organization, although complete religious freedom, including the freedom to just leave the church, became legal as late as 1923. A registry for the general population was created in 1971, after which there was some overlap between the record keeping of the secular and church authorities, until finally in 1999 they were all turned over to the secular side. Even now, some old church records are still only found in the so-called books of the church, although most of them have been digitized and moved to the secular administration, as far as I know. The new religious freedom of 1923 led to the creation of the Union of Civil Registries and eventually the founding of the Finnish Freethinkers Union. The current secular records still include information about everyone's religious affiliation if they are members of any official religious organization. This information is used to collect membership fees in the form of taxes from the members of the two main churches of Finland. The church had been vehemently anti-communist during the Civil War in 1918, which increased its political power in society compared to the situation pre-war at the beginning of the century. The losing side, the Reds, were socialists and communists, working class people. The church had thus sided with the strong, rich, powerful ruling class of society, which eventually became the winning side of the war. After the Civil War in the 1920s, there was an openly fascist movement in Finland called the Lapua movement. It was very dangerous. They even kidnapped the president and his wife at one point. It was strongly supported by many priests. When the movement lost the support of the general population, who saw them as too radical and dangerous, this was also reflected in the attitude toward the church, because so many priests had been supporting the movement. The church leadership denounced the movement in 1932, I'm assuming because they wanted to be popular. The Second World War began in Finland as the Winter War in 1939, when the Soviet Union attacked. Religion became one of the uniting forces for the Finnish people, although there were also many communists and other atheists also fighting against the invader. The war increased the prestige of the church, but not permanently. There had been some industry in Finland before the 1960s, but a very small portion of the people lived in cities and worked in industry before this time. Starting in the 60s, the country began to industrialize rapidly. Now occurred a huge social upheaval as people moved from the countryside to cities, and also to other countries, especially Sweden, in search of employment. The modernization of agriculture had improved production, making much of the large peasant population redundant. So a whole generation of young people flocked to the cities, but there weren't even enough apartments for all of them, not to mention jobs. People lost their so-called roots, which contributed to alienation from the church. Also, leftist thinking became more and more popular among the young, especially the university students in the 1970s. Immigration was almost unheard of in Finland until the 1990s, when especially people from Somalia made the phenomenon visible in Finland. Since then, Finnish society has become more and more pluralistic. Education was modernized in the 1970s, and information has become more and more available until finally the internet became accessible to pretty much all in 1995. Awareness of other cultures and religions has thus increased dramatically. Various new and old religions have entered Finland since the 1970s. At least one was invented in Finland. Karhun kansa, people of the bear, was officially recognized as a religion in 2013. Non-belief has also greatly increased in popularity since 1923, when religious freedom became law. Despite their non-belief, many de facto atheists remained members of the church. In the 1970s, the Freethinkers organization gained lots of members, but never gained much political significance. In 2003, a group of activists, mostly freethinkers, created an internet service called Eroa kirkosta, Leave the Church. It enabled people to easily quit their church membership. Prior to this, it was only possible to do that by personally visiting either the local secular or religious authorities. Now it just took a click of the mouse. At that time, 73% of the population were members of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland. Now, in 2022, church membership is already below 66.6%. Much of that change is due to the website, but in recent years it has no longer been especially important. The same service is provided by the Digital and Population Data Services Agency. The stream of people leaving the church is steady. In 1999, as much as 47% of the people reported believing in God as the church teaches. In 2019, that was down to 25%. Similarly, the percentage of people believing in some other kind of God fell from 27 to 18. People in Finland are becoming very much non-religious in general. Especially institutionalized religion is waning. The church is finding it very difficult to justify the privileged status it still enjoys in Finland. If the current trends continue, the church will lose its special status, and it will be relegated to the same status as any other organization. Its numbers will dwindle until it becomes completely irrelevant or even becomes extinct. Other religions will continue to exist, but as fairly irrelevant minority groups, for the most part. Their membership will be mostly made of immigrants from poor countries. But unfortunately, the trend will not continue. Climate change is leaving large parts of the planet uninhabitable. Food scarcity will begin wiping out our species, among many others. Climate refugees will flood Europe, Finland included. Millions of people, many from poor countries with poor education, with very traumatic experiences, from cultures where religions still were very important. The backlash will be an unfortunate rise in Finnish nationalism, racism, and most likely religiosity as well. It is unlikely that secular humanism or any other cerebral worldview can flourish in these circumstances. The emotional, irrational, primitive ways of thinking, or rather faith, will take over. Civilization will fall, science will be forgotten. The world will soon burn. Life as we know it will be gone. Will the flicker of the light of reason ever again light the universe? Or will it just remain in eternal darkness? Subscribe!